What happens when an empire decides your body belongs to the state? In the sprawling territories of the British Empire, from the fog-shrouded streets of London to the sun-scorched plains of India, punishment was never just about justice. It was theater. It was control. It was the systematic breaking of human will disguised as law. For 3 centuries, imperial authorities wielded flesh and fear as instruments of governance, transforming public squares into stages where power wrote its lessons in blood and humiliation. The empire's appetite for spectacle began with the simplest tool, exposure. Colonial administrators discovered early that shame could govern where armies could not. In Bengal, tax resistors found themselves stripped and chained to posts in village centers, left to endure the monsoon rains and burning sun while neighbors watched. The ritual served dual purposes. Punishment became performance, and performance became propaganda. Local records describe crowds gathering at dawn, some bringing food to share, while witnessing the state's judgment unfold in real time. But exposure was merely the opening act. The empire's true innovation lay in adapting punishment to local fears and customs. In the Caribbean sugar colonies, enslaved populations faced the treadmill, a massive wheel that prisoners powered with their own bodies for hours, producing nothing but exhaustion and submission. Plantation owners installed these devices in full view of the fields, ensuring every worker understood the cost of resistance. Grinding of wooden gears became the soundtrack of colonial power, audible from miles away. Yet even this paled before the empire's most calculated cruelty, the systematic destruction of identity itself. In Ireland, the Crown developed a punishment that attacked not just the body, but the soul, forcing Catholic priests to perform mock Protestant services before jeering crowds or face transportation to penal colonies. The spectacle was carefully choreographed, town squares filled with onlookers, officials in ceremonial dress, and the condemned forced to speak words that violated their deepest beliefs. Some chose exile over betrayal, others broke entirely. The empire's genius lay in making collaboration complicit. In India, the practice of blowing prisoners from cannon mouths, originally a Mughal punishment, was adopted and refined by British commanders who understood its symbolic power. The condemned was strapped to the barrel of a field gun, positioned so the explosion would scatter their remains beyond the possibility of proper burial rites. Hindu and Muslim spectators understood the spiritual dimension of this destruction. It was designed to terrify not just the living, but the dead. But the most insidious punishments were those that masqueraded as mercy. Transportation to Australia became the empire's solution to overcrowded prisons and political dissidents alike. The journey itself was punishment. Months in shipholds where disease and despair competed for victims. Those who survived faced a different kind of death, the slow erasure of homeland, language, and connection. Van Diemen's Land became synonymous with social death, where convicts scratched their names into rock faces, knowing they would never see England again. The empire's commitment to ritual extended even to its most private punishments. Flogging in the military followed precise protocols. The entire regiment assembled, drums beating a slow march as the condemned was stripped and tied to a triangle of halberds. Medical officers stood ready to pause the punishment if death seemed imminent, not from compassion, but to preserve the spectacle's power. Some historians argue these accounts exaggerate imperial cruelty, pointing to inconsistent application and regional variations in punishment practices. Others contend that colonial records systematically underreported the full scope of systematic violence. What remains undisputed is the intentional fusion of punishment with public performance, designed to embed imperial authority into the daily consciousness of subject populations. Women faced their own category of imperial punishment, designed to weaponize Victorian morality against colonial populations. In British Hong Kong, Chinese women caught in mixed relationships were subjected to head-shaving ceremonies in public markets. Their hair, a symbol of feminine virtue in Confucian culture falling to the ground as merchants and customers watched. The ritual combined racial policing with gender humiliation, sending clear messages about acceptable social boundaries. Colonial newspapers reported these events with clinical precision, transforming private shame into public policy. The empire's medical establishment became complicit in punishment through the weaponization of quarantine. During cholera outbreaks in Calcutta, British authorities used disease containment as pretense for collective punishment of neighborhoods that had harbored anti-colonial sentiment. Entire districts were sealed behind military cordons, their inhabitants denied trade, movement, or communication with the outside world. The quarantine lasted weeks beyond any medical necessity, turning public health into political theater. Survivors described the psychological weight of isolation, the way silence replaced the normal rhythms of urban life. Perhaps no punishment revealed the empire's sadistic creativity more than the use of native animals as instruments of execution. In the forests of Burma, British colonial courts sentenced rebels to death by elephant, a practice borrowed from local kingdoms but refined with imperial efficiency. The condemned was chained before a specially trained elephant whose keeper directed the animal to crush limbs individually before delivering the final blow. Colonial administrators invited local chiefs to witness these executions, understanding that the spectacular nature of the death would resonate through oral tradition for generations. Children were not exempt from imperial punishment's reach. In missionary schools across the empire, indigenous children faced systematic cultural annihilation disguised as education. But the true punishment came at week's end, when accumulated violations earned public beatings before the assembled school. Parents were required to attend, forced to watch their children suffer for maintaining connections to ancestral ways of knowing. The empire's naval forces developed their own rituals of maritime discipline. Keel hauling, dragging a sailor beneath a ship's hull on a rope, became less common by the 19th century, replaced by more psychologically calculated punishments. Sailors faced mastheading, suspension from the ship's highest point for hours, while the vessel pitched through Atlantic swells. The punishment combined physical torment with public humiliation, as the entire crew witnessed the victims struggle against gravity and weather. Naval logs record deaths from exposure and falls, clinical entries that mask the human cost of maintaining order at sea. The empire's courts martial elevated punishment to high theater, complete with ceremonial swords, uniformed judges, and carefully scripted proceedings. Officers faced cashiering, public dismissal from service that stripped them of rank, uniform, and social status in elaborate ceremonies designed to destroy military reputation. The condemned stood before assembled regiments, while his insignia were cut from his coat, his sword broken, and his name struck from regimental rolls. These rituals transformed individual failure into collective lesson, reinforcing hierarchies through spectacular downfall. Economic punishment became another tool of imperial control, wielding debt and confiscation as weapons against entire populations. In Ireland, during the Cromwellian conquest, landowners faced a choice: prove their loyalty through religious conversion or surrender their estates to Puritan settlers. The hearings took place in county courthouses packed with spectators, turning property seizure into public demonstration of Catholic defeat. Families watched centuries of inheritance dissolve in judicial proceedings that lasted mere minutes. their ancestral lands redistributed to strangers who spoke different languages and practiced different faiths. The empire's most sophisticated punishment was silence itself, the systematic erasure of inconvenient truths from official records. Colonial administrators perfected the art of bureaucratic violence, using paperwork and procedure to deny indigenous peoples legal existence. In Australia, Aboriginal populations found themselves classified as fauna in government documents, their humanity legislated out of existence through administrative decree. The punishment wasn't physical, but ontological, a kind of social death that preceded and enabled every other form of imperial violence. Yet resistance emerged even within these systems of control. Prisoners developed coded languages, smuggled messages, and created underground networks of support that authorities struggled to detect. In Bermuda's naval prison, convicts carved elaborate tunnel systems that served less as escape routes than as psychological assertions of agency. The tunnels were discovered decades later, their walls covered with names, dates, and messages that transformed punishment into a form of historical testimony. The empire's legacy isn't found in its monuments or trade routes, but in the psychological architecture it built through ritualized violence. Every public punishment was a lesson in power's reach, every spectacle a reminder that resistance carried costs measured in flesh and spirit. The empire understood what modern states sometimes forget. Control isn't just about law, it's about making that law visible, visceral, and unforgettable. The techniques perfected across centuries of colonial rule didn't disappear with decolonization. They evolved, adapted, and found new forms in the modern surveillance state. What would you have chosen, submission or the scaffold? Share your thoughts on how public punishment shapes political power across cultures and centuries.